Hey guys, this is a little excerpt of, basically I was talking about, and I don't know, maybe he doesn't say it here, but, basically the manufacturing technology basically goes up at 8% a year, and the demand only goes up 3 or 4%. We'll see. Let's see what he says.
Differently than I plan to talk about this, by talking about this problem in Japan. Because Japan, remember, in this process, went from being the leading manufacturing country in the world to being, and I think it's fair to say, an also run among world economies. Now, suppose I had come to you in Japan in 1990 and said, I have a terrific opportunity for you to dominate the world economy. And as a Japanese policymaker, not that they'd be likely to listen to me, but you eagerly say to me, oh, what is that opportunity? And I say agriculture. You would know I was out of my mind. That in agriculture, productivity growth is extremely high. There's a limit to demand growth. And trying to grow in a dying industry is what it means to be a dead parrot who doesn't invest. That is happening to manufacturing all over the world for exactly the same reasons. Productivity growth in manufacturing is 5 to 7%, and global demand growth in manufacturing is maybe at best 2 to 3%. What that means is that manufacturing companies who are trying to grow and trying to invest have a very difficult road to hoe. And it's in fact even worse than that. And I'll give you some data from the United States that illustrates that. If you look at U.S. investment in equipment and software, in real terms, it is about 50% higher relative to GDP than it was at the peak of the internet boom in 1999, 1998. If you look at nominal U.S. investment as a fraction of GDP, it's substantially below where it was at every other recent recovery. Those firms can make those investments at a fraction of the cost that they used to be able to make them at, precisely because the machinery that they're buying are manufactured goods, and the economics of making robots have improved with the economics of all manufacturing. So that's the first thing I think you have to keep in mind. I think you also see that when you look at the pattern of the incidence of this crisis, both the depth of the drop and the persistence across countries. It is not, by the way, the countries with the biggest financial bubbles that are in trouble. That's the US and the UK. The US actually is among the least affected in terms of the drop in GDP, and it's substantially above where it was in 2007 in GDP. Japan, by the way, where the companies were in really good shape at the beginning of the crisis, suffered a 7% drop peak to trough in GDP, and is still significantly below where it was in 2007 in output. Finland is the country that's most adversely affected and is way below where it was. It is the manufacturing economies, of course, the economies that have done best are the resource economies, like Canada, that have suffered. And that's the second aspect of this. But the third aspect of this actually also explains in much simpler terms what's going on in Europe, and I think that there's something that actually contradicts what Richard said about fund managers in Spain and so on. The manufacturing countries of the world cannot support their manufacturing sectors on domestic demand. They have to export. Now, you see that in Japan even through the crisis. Japanese exports and largely manufacturers rise steadily throughout the crisis. They think of themselves as a resource-poor country. They have to have a positive balance of payments for safety purposes, and they do it by exporting manufacturers. China has done manufacturing and export-led growth. You have Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. They used to run big deficits, but after the crisis of 1997, where they had to borrow in foreign currencies, the currencies collapsed and everybody went bankrupt, they were never going to do that again, and you see large and increasing surpluses. Countries like Germany with powerful manufacturing sectors, both in terms of the unions and the firms, have to save those sectors through imports. But there is one big global problem. When you add up over all countries, the surpluses and the deficits have to be zero. Somebody has to eat those surpluses. And you start to see it in 1997-98 when the Koreas, Indonesias, and Thailands who are running deficits run into trouble. They go from deficit to surplus. The deficits travel to Brazil, Mexico, Russia, and Argentina. In turn, they collapse. Who's the deficit country of last resort? It's the United States, because it borrows in its own currency. But there's a huge problem for the United States, and you see this in the crisis. Once you're running a chronic deficit of 6 to 7% of GDP to accommodate the rest of the world's surpluses, you have a huge problem sustaining full employment. And the way we did it was with a housing bubble and with a zero savings rate, which means that since the top 20% of households with 40% of the income save about 6% of GDP, the bottom 60% of households were just saving 6% and were spending 110% of their income, which is not sustainable. When that stopped in the United States as a result of the end of the housing bubble, the ability of the world to absorb these export surpluses went away. And I think we will have a continuing problem of trying to grow until countries make the transition consciously, and they're busy resisting it as hard as they can, out of this dying manufacturing sector. The analogy to the Depression, of course, is that in the Depression, what died was agriculture. And that sector brought down the industrial sector with it as agricultural incomes collapsed, and people weren't prepared to abandon it. Turns out that we got very lucky in the Depression, because what World War II did, certainly in the United States, is that not only did it provide Keynesian stimulus, but it was fabulous industrial policy. It got everybody off the farms and into the cities and the war factories or through the army, which was a transition they couldn't have afforded at that level of agricultural income to finance for themselves. So you've got this huge structural global problem, and no evidence that anybody's working on solving it. And it certainly accounts for the lack of investment, because you have this chronic deflationary pressure in the global economy as everybody tries to export. It also, by the way, accounts for the financial problems. Because one of the things in the United States that happens to the United States is when we run a deficit, the rest of the world has to eat the dollars. If the Chinese want to get rid of their dollars, they can either run a deficit on current account, which isn't going to happen in your lifetime, or they can reinvest them in the United States. When they reinvest them in the United States, of course, they drive interest rates down, and as outside, relatively stupid investors, they create an opportunity to do what Wall Street does best, which it did to the Japanese in the late 1980s, which is skin outside investors. But that seems to have been driven by the flip side of the deficits. Now, in Europe, you can see what's going on. You essentially, within the euro area, have a gold standard. Germany, which is the most competitive country that under normal circumstances would have its surplus limited by the rise of the mark, now doesn't have to worry about that. It means that the German surplus is stable and growing, and the other countries have to eat that surplus. As they eat that surplus and run deficits on current account, they have to import money on capital account. It's not that the Spanish managers are investing overseas, because we know on balance, Spain is running a capital account deficit. Italy is running a capital account deficit. It means that in order to sustain those economies at full employment, because the government deficit is not self-financing, you have to depend on the kindness of strangers. It's not the Spanish fund managers who you have to worry about. It's the German, Dutch, and other surplus country fund managers who have to recycle the money. And if we learned one lesson, I think, in the whole history of these kinds of crises is, do you all know who Blanche Dubois is? She's a character in Streetcar Named Desire, whose philosophy of life is, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. If you depend on outsiders for financing in these circumstances, if you depend on the kindness of strangers, you'll have to forgive me for saying this, what's going to happen to you is what happened to Blanche Dubois. She gets raped in the end. It's not a good economic philosophy. So you've got this fundamental financing problem allied to this chronic deflationary pressure, and it really is all a unified process. It's not that those parrots in those companies suddenly entered shock.
Given your diagnosis, what remedy do you prescribe for putting the world economy back into forward motion?
Okay, and I think you have to go back to why the Second World War cures the Depression. One of the things in the session I mentioned is that Paul Samuelson, who was the great Keynesian, thought at the end of the Second World War the U.S. was going back into the Depression. And he went all over Washington telling people this was going to happen. He was so wrong, he never made another economic forecast in his whole life. When you think about what is it that he missed, is he missed the fact that the necessary structural transformation of the economy. By the way, 30 to 35% of the U.S. population was working directly or indirectly in agriculture at the beginning of the Depression, and that population doesn't fall at all during the Depression because the people can't afford to move. The war moves them. It pays for them to go into the war plants, and it pays for them to go into the army. The forced savings finances the transition to manufacturing in the cities, although there's a terrible housing shortage, obviously, in the cities after the war. So you've got a very successful unconscious industrial policy. I think globally, in the countries that are trying to save their manufacturing sectors as sources of employment, which they're going to fail to do, by the way. It's going to be plenty of manufacturing, but it's going to be like agriculture. There aren't going to be a lot of manufacturing jobs. Germany, China, Japan have got to start to build big, powerful, effective service sectors. And it's in medical care, and it's in education, and it's in all sorts of other, hopefully, non-financial services. And that's going to take focused government intervention, not just building bridges to nowhere.
So you want it to be a catalyst to sectoral.
Yes, I think you want to have a vision that you've got people on a global basis trapped in manufacturing jobs that are going away. They can't do the migration across borders, so these exchange rate manipulations are trying to do it and are causing this chronic deflationary pressure. And you've got to go to the places where those people can move and generate those jobs, and that requires institution building. That requires financing and given imperfect information in financial markets. That's going to require government support. Let's go back to agriculture. What accounted for the low growth in demand in agriculture compared to the high rate of productivity growth? As heavy as Americans have tried to become in eating the agricultural surplus, there is a natural limit to how much agricultural output you can consume. It turns out that when you look at consuming manufacturers, there is just a natural limit to what people spend money on. At the margin, when you look at households, they spend, both as they get richer in cross sections and over time, they spend increasing fractions of their money on services, medical care, education, financial services actually for some reason, and personal services. Unless you're going to order people to buy manufacturers, it seems to me, like trying to order people to eat more food, you're not going to be able to correct that demand problem.
Thanks for watching, guys.